Welcome to your Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. I'm Denise Beck, and we're so glad you're here for the first episode of 2025. This episode is a legacy story. That means that we are retelling a story for you of a woman whose legacy has left an impact for all of us as we do our work around the world. A couple of things I'd love to point out before I turn it over to Sarah and Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer is that this is a really unique opportunity you have to listen today because not only is the story amazing, but we are getting to hear from the perspective of a national from the country where our legacy story worked. That doesn't happen very often. It's a special treat today. But something else we just want to make sure that you are aware of is that a tragedy does strike the family in the story that we're going to be talking about today, and 6 children are killed. And if that is something that might be a little more challenging for you to hear and you want to be prepared before you hit play, we wanted to let you know about that up here in the beginning. All right. I hope that you do take the time, whether that's in one play and listen to the whole story or you chunk it into bite-sized pieces as you process this amazing story. I hope you take the time to listen today. And I'm going to throw it over to Sarah to introduce you to this month's Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. I'm Sarah Hilkman, and we love getting to bring you the stories of women who faithfully serve around the world. And there are so many beautiful moments in the lives of these women where they got to see God work and maybe even experience miracles. But just like in our lives, there can be tragedy and disappointment and questions and waiting and all of those things. And the story of the woman that we are going to talk about today holds all these things as well. I am joined by our Velvet Ashes resident scholar, Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
We have a special guest with us today. Go ahead, Laura, and welcome her and introduce her.
Yeah, I'm excited to introduce our audience to Reverend Dr. Grace Rajan. She's a minister with the Methodist Church in India and currently based in South India. She's on leave as she pursues a dual THM degree program at Asbury Theological Seminary. Grace is a committed Christian and has a powerful testimony. After graduating as a student of engineering, she took a turn and started pursuing ministry. She's held active roles in the National Missionary Society, an organ of the ecumenical churches in India, and she's been very active in the YWCA. She's also held administrative positions in theological colleges like the Madras Theological Seminary and Calcutta Bible Seminary, which now play an active role in Indian theological education. She earned a D.Min degree from South Asia Seminary of Advanced Christian Studies in Bangalore, India. As a womanist thinker, her scholarship includes critically examining biblical texts from the perspective of women of color. She's a preacher and teacher and also has experience researching. Reverend Dr. Rajan has the ability to initiate new ministries and has been a founder of some mission work. In addition, she's traveled abroad and has wide experience in educational practices worldwide. So we are very privileged to have Grace with us today, and we're so excited to hear from her and the story that she has to share. So Grace is going to be talking to us about a figure that I actually came across in my doctoral studies. And the missionary's name is Ada Jones Lee. So Grace, can you tell us just a little bit about how you became interested in Ada Jones Lee?
Sure, Laura. And Ada, I first came to know during a visit to Calcutta. So my husband and I, we live in Coimbatore, a city in South India. So we traveled to attend some Methodist meetings in Calcutta, earlier Calcutta, now it is called Kolkata. And we happened to stay in a place called Lee Memorial Mission. Lee Memorial Mission. And it was my first time, so I went through the place, the facility, and I saw it was a very historic place. And I could see some pictures hanging in the facility, and that was the missionary's family. So it was about Ada, the missionary, her husband, and many kids. So there was a lot of pictures hanging around, and then I came to know that the kids, all of them had passed away on one single day, most of them. So I got really upset, and really wanted to know immediately what had happened. And I bought a literature there and started reading. But my pain at that point really was, my instant reaction was, why didn't I know about Ada Lee so far, being in India, a missionary family who had come here to Calcutta and had lived and done so many things, but yet the kids also have passed away in one single day, and nobody knew about her, and not even my friends. And it was a shock to me, and that was how I first learned about Ada Lee.
Hmm. Thank you, Grace, for sharing about how you got connected to the story of Ada Lee. And I just want to pause here for a moment, as you said that the Lee family suffered, a major loss with the death of their children all in one day. And I can't imagine the pain of losing a child. And my heart just feels heavy as I think about what the Lees experienced. I know that we will get to more of this part of Ada's story as we go through the podcast, but yeah, I just want to acknowledge the weight of that loss that is part of her story. And Grace, I also so appreciate your heart and reaction to not knowing the story of Ada Lee and her family and wanting others to know her story. That's so important to us on the Legacy podcast and part of why we do this. So, yeah, thank you. Well, as we continue, can you help us understand more of the context of when Ada Lee was living and serving? What, maybe was happening in India at the time? What were some of maybe the cultural practices? Kind of help us understand the time period that we're talking about.
Yes, Sarah. This is late 19th century, and India was under the British regime. And the later half of the 19th century, when the Lees lived in India, saw an increase in the number of large-scale famines in India. So famines were not new to India. There were severe famines earlier, but this was the most difficult kind of famines when the Lees lived here. So with tens of millions dying. In history, it is called the Bengal famine. Bengal today, it comprises of Bangladesh and the state which Kolkata is in West Bengal. So it is West Bengal and Bangladesh. So it is called the Bengal famine. Again, this was around the World War time. So India was a base for allied troops from many countries, including the UK, the United States, and China. And Calcutta, the place we are discussing now, was a colonial city that served as the capital at that point for the British India. Now, Delhi is the capital, but that time Calcutta was the capital. So, again, during the 19th century, there was religious superstitions that was very prevalent. So many social evils like killing of female infants, child marriage, polygamy, and sati. Sati is an Indian word, means the widows had to die. There's no other option. They had to die in the funeral pyre of the deceased husband. So this was prevalent. So the story sets in such a time, and women were denied their dignity and their values. They were discriminated in all stages of life. And caste untouchability was in practice. Illiteracy was high and education was denied to women. So, this was the context when the Lees landed in India.
Thanks, Grace, for kind of just laying that out there for us. I think we've explored some of that before in previous episodes, but to hear it from someone who knows more and is more directly connected to that history is helpful. So Ada didn't grow up in India. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about where she did come from, what her family was like, and her early faith development?
Yes, Ada was born in the United States. She was born on Easter, March 23, 1856, in a log house near the town of Smithton in West Virginia. Hers was a family of 12.
Wow.
Again, in that context and in your context, those were Civil War days, which left the countryside impoverished, and Ada's family suffered debt. At the age of 14, an aunt took her to Ohio, where she went to Skyo College, and there she had her first religious experience, a vision kind of thing, where she had this question, a vision, in a vision: would you be willing to leave home and friends and go to India? After an inner agony and lot of pain, she cried out, O Lord, I will do anything if thou wilt only save me. She received joy, peace, and God's assurance.
Well, I love hearing that of how God really called her and gave her this vision. Not all missionaries have like a specific, here's the place, that God might be calling them to. Um, yeah, can you talk, Grace, more about uh, where Ada went from there? She had this vision. How did she end up in India? How did she choose a cross cultural life? Did she serve with that particular organization?
Sure, Sarah. In college, she met a guy named David Hiram Lee, and they became friends. And David was based from Ohio, and David had already received his call for ministry. David later he joined the Ohio Conference. There he met William Taylor, who made an appeal for young men like David to go to India on the self-supporting mission. Ada's friend David offered himself for this and arrived in Agra, a city in India, in December 1875. It was David's friendship that added fuel in Ada's passion for India as a cross cultural missionary. Remember, I told you about her earlier spiritual encounter in which she had dedicated herself to missions in India? Yes. Meantime, Ada graduated, and what should she do now? Knowing her interest to go to India, her mother wanted her to stay at home. Ada had to fight her call. Some months later, she learned that she had an offer from the secretary of the American Union Missionary Society of New York, the first women's organization in America dedicated to sending of the gospel to the women of the Orient. This was the first women's organization. In 3 weeks' time, Ada decided and she sailed to India, landing in Bombay on December 22, 1876. The Milwaukee Journal, it said, I read like this in the Milwaukee Journal, in the biographical account of Ada. It's written like this: Ada Jones was the first woman sent by other women to save women. That was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, that's ties right into the women's missions movement that we've talked about on this podcast before. Women's work for women, women going out into the world to try to improve the lives of women around the world. So that's really exciting to hear that Ada is considered the first woman to be sent. And it sounded like you were mentioning before that they didn't actually go with the denominational board, but they were affiliated with the Methodists, correct?
I think David was associated with the Methodist,
Uh huh.
but Ada looks like she was sent by the American Union Missionary Society of New York.
And she wasn't, was she part of the Methodist Church though, previously?
At that point, I don't think she, if I am right, she not from the Methodist background. Only David.
So, can you tell us more about what happened with Ada and David? Clearly, we know this is heading somewhere, but maybe you can fill in some of the gaps for us.
Yeah. Interestingly, in India, Ada met her friend David again.
Mm-hmm.
Divine coordination, I believe, in a
Yes.
meeting in a place called Lucknow. And friendship ripened into love this time. But Ada felt she must fulfill her contract of 5 years of service before marrying David. Later on June 6, 1881, both got married in a Methodist church in Chennai, in South India, where I live right now. So their first home was in Bangalore, and David served as a pastor in Bangalore. This was when the couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Vida, Vida, Vida. And it's interesting to know. the name meaning. And actually, Ada writes like this: Vida is the feminine form of David, her husband, because she said Vida is more like, maybe she looked like her father. Ditto. I mean, she says like this. She has Ada is David Junior. She says David, just like David. So she had the name twisted. I mean, it is a feminine form of David. So she was named Veda, and Veda again. When you pronounce, it is like Veda of the Indian word Veda, because India is a land of Vedas, means scripture, land of scripture, Hindu scripture. So she connects this way: the first child, the feminine form of the name David, and Veda, the land of scriptures where she was born. So Vida is her name for the first child's name is Vida. So this is how the life started for them. It's a small family.
I love hearing about that, how their friendship grew, and it took time. Like, did she really make him wait the 5 years? I wasn't quite sure of the dates there.
Yeah, some timeline is missing actually. At some point some timelines are missing. I went through some books, but
Uh-huh.
I couldn't get it. Yeah.
But it sounds like they took their time and kind of let it happen, and probably some of our listeners can relate to that experience. I know I can. Just how God works it, that you meet someone and they're a friend, and then eventually they become more than that. And just to see that the passion that they had for being in India and ministering in India, and then that kind of brought them together again.
Yeah, I love that too, Laura, what you were saying, how they both had this heart for India and were serving, both serving there individually. And that's not always something that we see. Sometimes, people felt like, oh, I have to get married first or whatever. So yeah, I love that they were just doing what God had individually called them to do, but then also God wove their stories together. So yeah.
The Ada also went around the globe to meet her future husband. So she
Right.
traveled all the way from the United States
Oh,
and
that's true.
just to meet her old friend.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah. We never know how God's going to work.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I love the connections for her first child, just
Hmm.
with David also, but then kind of the meanings in India too. That there's kind of those double meanings, and to be able to have that even as a talking point with people to talk about the meaning of her name, I think
Hmm.
probably was helpful in building relationships.
Yeah. Grace, can you talk more about what kind of work Ada did in Calcutta? What did that look like over time? Were there people that she worked with there?
Sure. Ada was involved in a work called Zenana work. Is Zenana. The word Zenana is a Persian word that means women's apartments. So those days, women missionaries can meet women in their private places only. So this kind of ministry was called Zenana missions. It's basically women missionaries reaching to Indian women in secluded places meant for them. So this was the first ministry Ada was in as a single missionary to start with. And Ada was transferred to Allahabad, where she found beautiful Indian girls from good families as prisoners, with in one case with a depraved Eurasian man. And the girls begged Ada to save them, and Ada rescued, of course, a few of them. But when she saved one beautiful South Indian Brahmin girl named Jesudar, it was discovered at that point by the Eurasian who had made these girls captives, and he vowed to kill Ada.
Wow. So death threats that she was facing.
And he almost succeeded. I'll tell you briefly a dramatic story here. So, Jesudar, Ada tried to rescue, and Jesudar was the second wife of, she is a child, just a child, and she was the second wife of an uncle of the king of Benares. Many petty kings were ruling India then, and Jesudar was just 12 years of age. Her servant had betrayed her into the hands of a wicked woman who had sold her into prostitution. And that was how this little Brahmin girl had come into the grips of this Eurasian man. She came in touch with Ada and pleaded her to rescue her. Ada succeeded almost and escorted Jesudar in a train that was to pick her up from that spot and to run away to another place. But however, meantime, a mob that was bribed by Jesuda's captors chased them, and before they could board the train, they caught them. But somehow, in God's providence, police came there and they dispersed this mob. And the captor was later sued by the court. And when it came to who would take care of Jesuda, her husband, that is this Eurasian fellow, he married. And so her husband and her mom termed her as outcast. And later, when Jesuda was in an orphanage run by Ada, and there again the captor came again and stepped in one night. But again, that's a dramatic story. Again, the watchman awoke his companions and God gave them protection. And by then, the captor had escaped again. Jesuda, this little bright girl, later she met a Christian man and married and got settled. That's how the story ends. So this is a beautiful narration. It kind of tells us what kind of a situation India was in at that time.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a dangerous time to be a woman, whether you were the one being in captive or trying to set others free.
Yeah, but also I feel like shows us a peek into Ada's determination and courage and the fact that, she was fighting for these girls and wanting to protect them and care for them. So yeah, I love that example of her work, Grace. Thank you.
So beyond the work that they did, Ada and David eventually had a large number of children. Grace, could you tell us some stories about them and what they were like?
Sure. After their first child's birth in India, David started to have health challenges due to malaria. And the small family of three sailed to New York back, a travel that took 3 months and 10 days. So David Lee, he again joined the Ohio Conference, and had a powerful ministry for many years there. And it was here they had the additional five children. So now 1 plus 5, 6. India was etched in David and Ada's minds, but India missions was impossible because due to lack of funds, and mission leaders pointed to their big family. And this barrier was so heavy to the extent that Ada started to pray, "Take this burden for the women and children off my heart, Lord, and lay upon some other woman who can go and give me relief." And God seemed to say, "Do you not remember that the silver and gold are mine and the cattle on 1,000 hills?" And true to God's words, the fundraising goal was met. David and Ada, with their 6 children, landed in Calcutta, and the Zenana mission continued with the women in seclusion. So the 6 kids, we come to know about them a little bit, where Ada had journaled a lot about the little kids, and it comes in their letters, correspondences, and the diary, and a little introduction of all the 6. Vida, the oldest of all, she learned the local language, Bengali, they say, or Bangla. She learned the local language and was fluent to the extent that she led a Sunday school consisting of 75 kids.
Wow.
Reading a letter of her to her friend in US, I can easily see that she was already a missionary to many around her. And Vida played the violin, but her special instrument was the guitar. And coming to her next sister, her sister Lois was the organist of the family. And the 2 boys who were born later, they were violinists. And together with Vida and Louis and the boys with their instruments, they often formed a quartet. The first 4 formed a quartet, and whose home concerts made the evenings a delight. Ada writes. One song they often sang was, "In our Father's blessed keeping, I'm happy, safe, and free. While his eye is on the sparrow, I shall not forgotten be."
Mm. That's
Another
beautiful.
favorite of the boys was when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.
Mm-hmm.
And one favorite song, much before their last years, that was Peace, Perfect Peace. There'll be no dark valley when Jesus comes, and we'll never say goodbye in heaven.
Mm.
Lois wanted to be a medical missionary. One diary entry from the ruins later they found, it says like this. Lois said, I found out that my great grandfather on Mama's side, and now we realize that Mama's also was Methodist. I'm sorry, we'll make a correction there. I found out that my great grandfather on Mama's side was a Methodist preacher. My grandpa on Papa's side was a local Methodist preacher. My honorable dad is a Methodist preacher, and my kids will most likely be Methodist preachers. That was what she has written. So both Methodist heritage, right? And
Mm-hmm.
humorously, she has written that Wilbur, the next child, was the couple Samuel. They said, "Baby Wilbur, this the baby, this the guy who survived many threats to due to sickness even earlier, and once he was even saved from being washed away by a wave." And again, this was the guy who narrated the tragic ordeal later that would come to know. So this was Wilbur, the couple Samuel. And every child's conversion has been narrated so clearly and vividly how they accepted the Lord even when they were young.
Mm.
And little Herbert, the fourth, and he was a 5 year old when he deliberately and definitely gave his life to Jesus. Just 5 year old in a children's service held at a camp meeting. And Herbert could not bear to see others suffer and had many friends among the poor and the native Indians.
Thank you so much for sharing about the children, Grace. I can picture them playing their instruments, worshiping the Lord, being together. And yeah, you've just painted a vivid picture for us of what their family was like and what they were like as children. And I just feel privileged to have that picture into their family life and into their ministry and how the children were involved in the ministry, even with the oldest leading Sunday school and some of the younger ones worshiping with music and blessing people that way. It's
Yeah.
wonderful just to picture what their family life was like, even though they originally they thought the children were gonna. It was kind of like holding them back from going back to India. It sounds like they were very much involved in the work there.
Two more kids. I'll add two more kids, a reference to two more kids here. The fifth and the sixth. Ada. The fifth was named after her mom because Papa named the fifth kid as Ada and after her mom. Her mom called her Eunice, however. So Ada Eunice. So happy victory was the meaning, saying that God will give them victory in raising missionary fund for India. So meaningful names. And in her last letter, before the tragedy struck them, little Ada had spoke of her desire to always have a pure heart. So the last one in order at this point, the sixth child, little Esther, and she had a Hindu friend, it seems, named Indubala. Indubala, and this little one was married when she was 6 year old, the Hindu girl, Indubala, and the Lees were pleading with Wayne not to do that, but the parents they didn't obey the Lee's plea, and so the child marriage happened. So such is the fate of Indian kids again, and the last one's friend Indubala's from her life we come to know this. And again, about little Esther, and the last Sunday evening prayer meeting before the tragedy struck, it seems the little one prayed, "Oh Lord, bless not only this family, but all the families in the whole world." So, children also had a good habit of saving money, and they had saved up to $20 that time, and which later they put in the memorial building fund. So, they were raised in Christian values, they were scripturally oriented. They had memorized verses. They had their regular worships. That was their lifestyle. They sang together, as you said. And this is a very, very ideal Christian upbringing, I think. That was how they grew.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah. Like Laura said, just such a privilege to hear these sweet stories and get to know the kids more. And it makes it so hard to ask the next question or go to the next part of the story, Grace. But you've alluded to a tragedy that struck the family. And in September of 1899, the family experienced a great disaster. And so, yeah, this part of the story might be hard for some of us to hear. But can you tell us what happened next in their story?
Yeah. Calcutta being a hot and a humid place, the Lees had rented a two-storied cottage in Darjeeling, which is further north of Calcutta, a hill station. So the Lees spent a few weeks of vacation there and left the kids there, and they left to Calcutta for building their newly purchased property. And in the meantime, there was 36 hours of rainfall in the hills in Darjeeling, and the two-story cottage it slipped off. This
Mm.
was September 24, 1899. And three of their six kids were teens by then. Let me say their ages at this point. Vida was 17, Lois 15, Wilbur 13, Herbert 11, Ada Eunice 8, and Esther was 5. And the children made an attempt to save themselves, but they got buried, except for the one, Wilbur, the 13-year-old. And it is through Wilbur's narratives that we come to know what had happened. Because David and Ada Lee, they immediately somehow tried their best to go to the spot. It's a long journey, a long story, and how they carried a newly born baby by the time. And so carrying the little baby on the shoulders. We have pictures of all that and how they carried, and it was a difficult journey. They reached a hospital there, and Wilbur was there, who was surviving but by the time he lived for a few more days to narrate the ordeal of the fateful day. And Wilbur said about Vida, the oldest one, who made this prayer: "If the Lord wishes, He can save us together, and if not, He will take us together." They all had knelt in prayer several times, asking God to protect them. They had a knock at the door on that day. A local man came crippled, his face bleeding. Since he was ill and shivering, the children, even at that point, they started to care the local man. And Vida took a cloth and wiped the blood from his face with a rug. They wrapped him. This man survived and later told that the last time he saw the children, they were kneeling together in prayer. And the center of the room had cracked open while they were still praying. And Vida had said, the older one, she was like a mother to the kids. She said, "Children, the house is coming down and we will soon be in heaven." And Wilbur at this point continued in the hospital bed. He said, "Mama, we felt as if we were coming home to you by train. We said to each other, if Papa and Mama and baby Frank were only here, we could all go together to heaven." And Vida's face looked like an angel when she talked all this. And Wilbur also was telling about Jesuda. This is another Jesuda, not the one we discussed earlier. Another Bengali girl who was also with this group of kids at that time, a Bengali girl. And she also was kneeling and praying, "Oh, merciful God, take us now." These were her last words. Around this time, Wilbur said that he was thrown more than 100 feet down the mountainside, and he was spotted by some helpful villagers. And after a desperate struggle, they took him to the hospital. Now, in the hospital bed, again, Ada knew that Wilbur was going to die, and she took time to assure him of his salvation. And the little teenager often said to his mom, "My precious mama, you are my sweetheart." And in that painful ordeal, Ada saw a glimpse of heaven, seeing Wilbur just entering in and the other children greeting him, all so happy. The vision was so real and gave her supernatural strength. to the awful days that she was going to face. And Wilbur also joined his brothers and sisters 8 days after the landslide.
Wow, Grace. I'm just struck by the tragedy that the Lees faced, but also just the deep, deep faith that their children possessed to be able to face death with such faith. It's staggering. Yeah, it's hard to know what to say after hearing a story like that. Curious how the Lees ended up moving forward after such a tragedy. I just think about I have one daughter, and the thought of losing her just it would wreck me. So how did they move forward and continue on?
The mission grew actually after this because this news went far and wide throughout the globe, it said, and many came to know at that point. Unfortunately, we have forgotten these days, but it was known those days. And the mission grew. The Lee Memorial Mission was organized in memory of their 6 biological children and that one spiritual child. And the work grew again with famine hit orphans. And it was famine time then. And so there were so many orphans. So the home and the activities grew in Calcutta, and they planned for new buildings, and they undertook several projects for the sake of kids like Jesuda and the kids who are suffering by famine at the point. And they also had their family grow. They had one more son, Albert, next to Frank. So after completing their studies, these two boys, Frank and Albert, they came to India. Frank was a graduate in medicine, and that's how the story goes. And Dr. Lee, meantime, he became ill and passed to his heavenly home on his 74th birthday. And his body is laid along with the kids in Darjeeling, his mortal remains.
It sounds like they poured their lives into other children from what you're saying.
Yeah, and continued to work. I mean, I think they could have rightly been done. Had a very different rest of their life, but the fact that they continued to serve, I think, just shows their dedication and their heart. Can you talk about what happened in Ada's life, in her later life, after her husband passed away?
Yes, Mrs. Ada Lee was singled, but yet she was strong. And the girls who found refuge in Lee Memorial Mission, they all became outstanding Christians, both in spiritual and secular lives. We come to know most of them, and they are living even today. Some of them whom I know are great people. Ada, when she was 80-year-old, she turned the work over to the Griffiths, the next missionaries who landed it in India. On 11 May 1948, Mother Lee, she rested on the arms of Jesus at a ripe old age of 92. And she was also buried at the Lower Circular Road Cemetery in Calcutta in the Indian soil which she loved so dearly. The administration later transitioned to Indian nationals by the year 1972, and the mission is still going on.
Wow. So just thinking about her life, Grace, how would you sum up her legacy?
She's a queen among women, that's what I can say, a wondrous personality. As a single woman, before her marriage, she was adventurous to move out of her comfort zone, going to an unknown destination. And as a parent, she has raised her children so well. She has set the bar high. I too think of my only one son. I am blessed with just one son. And I'm still struggling whether I am doing the right thing. But here we find a parent who has raised the children so well to the extent that all the kids knew the Lord and were so confident of meeting Jesus, knowing that they're going to die. And again, as a single woman towards the end of her life, as a widow, her sacrifice, her strength, they're stunning. So in the Indian context, there had been several single women like this. If you take of Mother Teresa and Ida Scudder and Pandita Ramabai and Amy Carmichael. They all, as single women, they have achieved and they have set a legacy, and the legacy goes on. And Ada Lee is in that group. And again, unfortunately, not many know Ada Lee. That's my pain at this point. And I've started writing about her and already talking about her to many groups. I only wish that her life story would be filmed, because there's so much of dramatic details here. And if only it could be filmed, that would be great, because they had filmed William Carey, who had been a missionary to India. And these were nevertheless, none less than all those missionaries. And Ada Lee is nevertheless lesser in any way, the way she has contributed, and why people are not still getting to know about her. That's my burden and that's my pain.
Well, Grace, I'm so glad that you have taken this opportunity to share Ada's story with us and to all of the women, and we do have some men listeners, but all the people that listen to our podcast. And I, one of the things that has struck me as you just brought up some of those names, we can focus a lot on the work that missionaries from the past have done, and it sounds like Ada did a lot of great work, but the legacy of the faith of her children has just really stuck out to me. That she poured so much into her children, and that's such a powerful part of her legacy. As you think about everything that you've shared with us and just all that you know about Ada's story, what do you hope our listeners remember about Ada's life, her faith, her ministry? How does Ada's life still speak to us today?
Yes, sir. In fact, like how you said, the spirituality of the children, that remains a strong learning for us. And I even came to know about a book which is even written in the children's name, called The Seven Heroic Children by Morgan and Scott. So that is a great takeaway. And so, one thing I would want our listeners to keep in mind is about caring for our children, leaving a spiritual legacy, and also the need to journal our lives and our children's lives. So that stuck hard on me, because I am interested in writing also, and looking into the aspect of, if not Ada Lee has journaled all these things, and the children had not journaled all these things, and this rich legacy would have been lost. So it's very important that we have to grab the media and write and do things like what we are doing right now, and place everything in record. And only then the future generation will be able to know what has happened in the past. And raising children in godly way is the big takeaway of this thing, because they were confident that all the children entered into eternity, and that had given them the hope to proceed. That's the biggest takeaway.
I've just really appreciated your perspective on everything, Grace. I think often we're presenting the stories of missionaries coming from the same background as the missionaries, as and to hear the perspective of someone from India who is learning about a missionary that's gone to your country, and to just hear your appreciation and your thoughts for that is really rich. I love. I've just really appreciated that about your perspective, and what you see in Ada might not be what maybe someone from my background would have seen. And so I really appreciate what you've highlighted for us today, and just this reminder to invest in our children, and to make sure that they know Jesus, and that we know that if they face the kinds of things that Ada's children faced, that they'll be secure, and they'll have faith that God is in control, and that they'll be with him.
Yeah. And I love too, just following up on that, Laura. I love, Grace, that you mentioned the spiritual children that are part of Ada's story too. Just thinking, as someone who's single, I don't have my own children, but I can invest in the lives of the children that are in my life. And so I love that that's part of Ada's story as well. Just, yeah.
I love that. Love that, Sarah. Like how, even I always think about Mother Teresa. She was called Mother Teresa in India.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have a child of her own, but she gave birth to all the children in our nation. I mean, she is called Mother Teresa. And Amy Carmichael I was referring to, she also in South India, she was referred to as Amma, means mother. She didn't have a child of her own. So these are people who didn't have a biological children, but they had so many spiritual children. That's a beautiful
Right.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Grace, thank you so much for the work that you have done to make sure that Ada's story is not forgotten. That's so important. And I love, too, your reminder that we need to record our stories, too, because we all have these stories of ways that God is working and the courage that God gives us in the midst of very ordinary days, but also very challenging and hard days, and the joys of His work in us. So, yeah, that is such a good reminder for us. Thank you, Grace, for all of your time and your work to make sure that Ada's story is not forgotten.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lara.
Friends, we are so thankful that you are here, and we hope that you enjoyed Ada's story today, or that you have taken encouragement from the richness of Ada's faith and the faith of her family. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to being with you next time on the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.